Sure, and I can just begin by way of introduction. My name is Victoria Yunez Behm. I am a student right now at Duke Divinity School and a Theology, Medicine, and Culture Fellow at Duke. So I am studying with Ellen Davis and Amy Laura Hall and many others. So I'm really honored to be part of the series with such accomplished scholars and theologians and ethicists. My main focus is a little bit different. I'm a certified and clinical nutritionist, so my background is in integrative medicine, and I come to Duke TMC for theological formation around my particular area of expertise, which is personalized nutrition. And I ask some of these questions that we'll go through in the talk as part of that exploration for my thesis project. So I really do welcome your input and your questions in helping me to refine my thinking on these topics. And specifically with regard to clinical nutrition, as I mentioned, I'm a trained clinical nutritionist. I'm not practicing right now as I'm doing a lot of work in other areas. I teach as adjunct faculty at the Maryland University of Integrative Health. And I'm also, I work with the American Nutrition Association, which is a national organization that certifies nutritionists, trains nutritionists for practice, and otherwise supports the expansion of nutrition in healthcare as a foundational element of our health. So one of the things that I do in my work with the American Nutrition Association is to really promote the health of society through nutrition and specifically personalized nutrition. So this paper is a paper that I worked on with several colleagues that sought to define personalized nutrition. So I'm going to start there and sort of zoom out, and we'll get to the theology toward the end, but I'm going to discuss some of the historical and philosophical and theological questions that come up as I explore this topic of longevity. And I'll say interventions, and specifically we'll be looking at nutrition and fasting as an intervention that's being applied both for biological reasons, and we'll talk about that with regard to life extension, but also has a deep, rich history as a theological and spiritual practice. So I hope you'll follow along. We'll talk about a lot of the figures in these spaces, and we'll get to some of the theological questions toward the end. So personalized nutrition, as you can see here, is a form of person-centered nutrition care that utilizes the latest research in genomics alongside technologies to prevent, manage, and treat disease and optimize health. So in my daily work, I think a lot about how to promote health, how others can promote health through their clinical practices, through their research. And in my field, personalized nutrition, I really do believe that it holds a lot of potential, tremendous promise for helping to move society's health in a better direction, getting to the root of some of the problems of the causes of illness and disease, as well as attending to the particularities of someone's biology. The foundational concept in personalized medicine, personalized nutrition, personalized health is that everyone's biology is different. You are unique. You have a unique biochemical fingerprint, if you will. And so we have right now this moment of technological and scientific advancement where we might have the potential to predict someone's health risk, but also the responses to particular interventions, such as the response to a drug, a response to a diet therapy, a response to a supplement protocol. And we're not there yet, but this is really the hope and the promise of precision health, precision medicine. And it's a very exciting promise. It's an exciting aim. If we can predict, have more predictive capacities in healthcare, imagine the savings, imagine the industry for this. So this slide is showing the market being projected to amass about $21.4 billion in revenue by 2028. You might have heard that NIH has awarded $170 million to fund the Nutrition for Precision Health Research project, and they're developing algorithms that will eventually, hopefully, be able to help us predict individual responses to dietary patterns and foods. And this particular research study is also supported by the All of Us research initiative, which is seeking to gather about 1 million individuals that are underrepresented in healthcare research. So there's a huge push for diversifying the pool of data that we have in health research. A lot of the studies are in homogeneous populations, and so we want to expand and understand hey, if we have this population, this group of people, will the intervention be as effective? Do we expect the same outcomes? And that's all part of this effort to gather data that can help us understand and predict responses better. So if we have that ability, if we can predict someone's response to an intervention like a dietary pattern, a drug, or a supplement protocol, we'll need an industry to support that, and there's a lot of investment already happening in the industry. So you can see here, there are hundreds of startup companies, but you can see even food and beverage companies, large ones, such as PepsiCo, are investing in accelerating and incubating ideas around personalized nutrition. So I think the future business is going to be booming, and it continues to be today. So much of the attention in this field, and I give that framework to move us into longevity, which is where a lot of the energy and attention in the field are being put. So the longevity movement, or the anti-aging movement, and I think it's interesting to think about it as a pro of extending life, or as a con of being anti-aging. So you can use the language that is more interesting to you. But this idea I'll call it the longevity movement, really capitalizes on this latest technology and research toward a progressive goal of extending human lifespan. So that's really where we're going to focus today. But I think to stop the definition of the longevity movement there really undercuts and undersells the aspirations of this movement. Its proponents hail from scientific fields, new ones like biogerontology, as well as established fields like oncology and molecular biology, clinical fields including my own, personalized nutrition and precision medicine. There are many fields that are coming together and really looking toward this progressive goal of extending human lifespan as a desired outcome of their research and work. Science and technology have now progressed to such a point that we can now anticipate not just the extension of lifespan, but also the extension of health span, which is the duration of human health. So if you live longer, the argument might be, I don't want to do that unless the quality of my life is very good. Otherwise, and we'll see some folks who are on both sides of this coin here in a little while, but that's essentially the argument. And recent research points to various biological mechanisms that determine the aging process. So a lot of research in the area of genetics, metabolism, or metabolomics. There's a lot of research in chromosome telomere length, how temperature affects our aging rates, and the age of reproduction, the age at which an organism reproduces, also can affect the longevity of its offspring. And then I don't know if anyone's been paying attention over the last few years to some of the NASA research, the twin study where there was a twin on Earth and a twin in space, and they were measuring the length of telomeres to see how aging differed, and the twin in space was aging more rapidly. So we have lots of interesting data, and I'm not a data analyst, so that's not my area, but I think that all of that is coming together and pooling as we discuss and discover more about what aging looks like and how we might intervene to prevent aging in this particular case. So again, I'll emphasize, as I mentioned before, fasting as a biological tool and also a spiritual discipline that is being explored right now when it comes to longevity experiments. And I do also argue that the longevity movement has deep roots in transhumanism. So we'll talk a little bit about transhumanist thought, and I'm just, we have limited time, and there are probably many other thinkers that have contributed to transhumanism, and I'll highlight a few here. And I think that this question of longevity, in my mind, represents one of humanity's most fundamental questions. Why do we suffer and die? And it's an age-old question. This is not a new endeavor. So as we're talking about the future of longevity experiments and interventions, I think that I'll highlight some of the historical questions that come up for me as I've looked at this as well. And I think that it's an interesting question as well, what it means for humans to be anti-aging. If we frame it in the negative, how could we be anti-aging if it is such a natural and arguably inevitable process of being human? And according to a 2014 Pfizer study, about 87% of respondents, it was not a large study, it was about 2,000 people surveyed, but 87% of respondents over 18 are afraid of aging. So at the same time, surveys from around the world suggest that those over 50 actually rate their happiness more positively and end up living healthier lives. So we have sort of this tension in the surveys anyway, the survey data between those who are afraid of getting older or aging and those who are in perhaps the latter half of their lives, suggesting that it's actually a very positive experience or can be. So we'll explore some of those questions. But I want to pose how we got this notion, this question, the notion that aging is a bad thing. Where did this anti-aging movement really begin? And again, I'd like to posit that this is nothing new. Tales of sacred restorative waters existed well before the Spanish conquistador Juan Ponce de Leon set out across La Florida searching for the fountain of youth. In fact, Alexander the Great is said to have found a healing river of paradise in the 4th century BC, which he eventually believed would lead to the Garden of Eden. And the book of Genesis, of course, paints a picture of Eden as promise and paradise for humans who were made to live in this perfect world with a loving, generous God who is creative and abundant. And the author of Genesis presents a particular swindling serpent as promising something like immortality to the people. You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of the tree, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God. Is that promise as old as time, perhaps? And it's really hard to overstate how that idea has, to the extent to which that narrative has really influenced Western thinking in particular. So I'm going to present a few historical figures here. So I've given you a couple of faces to ponder, and I'll share a little bit about their ideas. So we'll fast forward to the 16th century, and of course you have Renaissance statesman Francis Bacon, who was an early proponent of natural philosophy and the scientific method, and he promoted the cultural imperative to eliminate suffering, that was really the aim of human life and human history. And he wanted to elevate human choice, specifically through the scientific method and through medicine. And we've adopted this imperative over the course of history. We have this societal adoption of this idea that we should not suffer, that medicine should alleviate, remove, and potentially eradicate suffering. And that's a question and an issue that many other bioethicists have taken up in recent years. And of course, this has led to a sort of self-determination and essentialization of the body that we still contend with in medicine today, and also an instrumentalization of nature as we attempt to fulfill this new human moral project of eliminating suffering. And medicine has really become sort of the hope and the salvation, the ultimate hope for us all. So theologian Gerald McKinney describes this as the Baconian project, and I'll reference that a couple of times. But for McKinney, this modern obsession with bodily perfection is very problematic. Eradicating suffering through this imperative was developed alongside modern technology. And so we now have this moment in history where a lot of our efforts in science and in medicine are toward the elimination or eradication of suffering. And I think to some extent, I'll argue that sort of that idea that medicine is our ultimate hope for salvation really it puts us in denial in a bit about the susceptibility to suffering that we have as humans in bodies. So Bacon's contemporary, Rene Descartes, who's also pictured here, who's a mathematician, natural philosopher, and a metaphysician, posited that non-human animals are machines, and that the idea that there's any sort of consciousness or any sort of value to animal life, he undercut that idea. It was very mechanistic. So you'll see that the idea being developed further by Julian Huxley de la Matière, and he took that and ran with it, essentially arguing that humans are also machines. And he wrote a text called Man, a Machine, extending that Cartesian argument. There was another philosopher, French philosopher, Nicolas de Condorcet, and also American founding father Benjamin Franklin, who was a self-proclaimed thorough deist. They began to consider whether the incipient medical sciences could be applied to the extension of human life. So this is really that moment where we have a lot of philosophical thinkers positing that animals are machines, human are machines. How do we operate? Is there any purpose for religion? Is there any sort of spiritual element to the human being? And all of these individuals leading up to questions about the application of medicine. So then a new project called transhumanism emerged from this fertile ground of post-Enlightenment thinking. And I will introduce now Julian Huxley, who was a thinker in this area and a 20th century eugenicist and biologist who studied flatworms, actually. And he coined the term transhumanism, saying that the human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself, not just sporadically, an individual here in one way, an individual there in another way, but in its entirety, as humanity. We need a new name for this belief. Perhaps transhumanism will serve. Man remaining man, but transcending himself by realizing new possibilities of and for this human nature. And he was interested in this idea that the lifespan could be prolonged, and his experimental research on flatworms, which he spiritedly titled Long Sought Elixir of Life is Found, Oxford Savant Experiments Successful, but alas, with flatworms. He challenged the accepted view of a normal life cycle as this unstoppable process of cell replication, differentiation, and aging, and eventually cell death, and suggested that this trajectory was not inevitable or necessarily irreversible. So that notion of cell life, the prolongation of cellular life, has really laid the groundwork for the research that's happening now. He suggested, at least from my research, was the first to suggest that age was not chronologically driven, but biologically driven. So I don't know if anyone remembers this news clipping, but this idea has evolved and in some way has held fast. Advances in genetic science in particular and computational technology have allowed scientists to accomplish incredibly precise findings such as mapping and very recently completing a human DNA sequence. This work will have unforeseen implications for the future of medicine and science for decades and centuries to come, according to NIH. And as my co-authors and I suggested in the paper that I pointed to earlier, novel research methods and the continued development of innovative technology solutions will lead to increased individualization and increased potential in these areas. And more products, more services, as I mentioned, the industry growing as well. So with so much energy and money being put toward extending the human lifespan and health span, our search for immortality and the eradication of suffering, I suggest, have taken on a certain gloss and a sort of high-tech manifest destiny of the self that I think we as Christians really need to contend with and question. So we're sort of at this moment in history where we're wondering, how can we bioengineer ourselves to beat the odds, to extend our lives? And from what I can tell, cryonic preservation hasn't really panned out quite yet. So what other tricks do we have up our sleeves? This clip from Vogue at the top is interesting and sort of posits this fundamental question of aging, whether and how interventions can alter the mechanistic processes of aging. So in 2020, Vogue published this, Is Aging a Disease You Can Reverse? A look at the science behind the longevity movement. And there are many scientists in the field of longevity right now who are asking the FDA to actually list aging as a disease. Because if it is a disease, then we can treat it and we can have drugs for it and on and on. So this is a very interesting question sort of at the core of the longevity movement, at least in my field right now. So as I mentioned, the argument, I want to live a long and healthy life, but only if it's going to go well for me, only if I don't have debilitating disease, my mental and physical faculties remain intact. Contemporary developments in technology, especially high-throughput omics technologies and long-read DNA sequences, have aided researchers in discoveries in this area and developments that are really bringing us to the precipice, I would suggest, of novel discoveries regarding the extension of lifespan and health span. And there are many early adopters of this research as well. Some of them are in academic and scientific institutions. And then there are DIY, sort of citizen science or at-home ways of doing this through biohacking. So is anyone familiar with the term biohacking? Okay. So it's essentially this idea that of human augmentation by tweaking, or human enhancement by tweaking bioengineering at home through do-it-yourself methods. And these can improve performance, health, and well-being through strategic interventions. So right now, for a lot of people, it's trial and error. I know some scientists who wear, one in particular, who wears about 8 smartwatches, has continuous glucose monitors, has the tracking device, everything. He's a data miner. He looks crazy when he shows up with all this technology on him, but his goal is to capture as much data as possible about himself and figure out the algorithm for how to predict and potentially change his health outcomes as a result. So these strategic interventions to really change and alter our outcomes is part of the goal of biohacking. And so I'm going to move into, don't be too scared if you haven't taken a science class recently, but the idea here is that one of the ways in which we can be biohacking, and one of the really promising areas of exploration in scientific research right now is in genomics. You can get your entire genome sequenced. Has anyone taken one of the at-home genetic tests, whether for health or just ancestry? Okay. Some of us, yeah. So you can do that. It's not very expensive. It's rather affordable these days, usually under $100. We know what we're made of. We know. We have the code of what we're made of. What we've found is we can't change the hardware, if you will, but we can change the software. We can actually alter how the genes are expressing. And these little yellow hexagons here are that represent DNA methylation. I won't get too far down that path, but this is essentially telling your genes what to do. They're methyl groups that attach to your DNA, and they can sort of turn them on and off, if you will. And this is called epigenetics. So it's a layer over the genes that can help the genes to change sort of the course of action. And researchers are working really to figure out how DNA methylation contributes to aging and disease so we can influence genetic expression toward desirable outcomes. And this has led to a slew of proposals of what are called biological clocks, which are listed, many of which are listed here. And the idea of a biological clock is essentially to attempt to predict how to nip disease in the bud. How are tissues aging, and what can we do to stave off death and decay and extend our health span? So I've highlighted one here, the Horvath clock. And Steve Horvath is one of the most famous researchers in this area. And in 2013, he developed an age predictive tool, which is what he calls it, that uses previously unknown timekeeping mechanisms in the body to accurately gauge accurately gauge the age of diverse human organs, tissues, and cell types. So according to his research, various tissues and cell types age differently. And there's some unfortunate findings, which you can come ask me about later. But in order to do this research, they focused on pinpointing biomarkers that keep time throughout the body in different tissues. Now, these researchers are translating that information. Building on this, naturopath and functional medicine Dr. Cara Fitzgerald, who I have the pleasure of knowing, has studied the effects of diet and lifestyle interventions. And in her clinic in Sandy Hook, she has developed a randomized controlled trial to pilot trial and studied intermittent fasting and other as part of her protocol. And her research, which was a fairly small study in healthy males, found that that dietary protocol could reverse Horvath DNA methylation age by 2 to 3 years. And of course, that includes intermittent fasting. And this is getting massive attention. Imagine the headline, which is all over the place if you want to look it up later. You can reverse aging. You can add 2 to 3 years of your life by following this protocol. And there's a book called Younger You, which she just published, which essentially lays out this protocol and how you can participate. Again, this is a small pilot trial in healthy males, but of course getting a lot of attention. And another well-respected scientist here whose work is very influential in anti-aging movement is Valter Longo at USC. He's a director of the Longevity Institute, and he's sometimes called the grandfather of the science of fasting, and was named by Time among the top 50 most influential scientists, or people actually, in health, for his work regarding how cells sense food, and subsequent development of the fasting mimicking diet, which is basically the idea of how to fast while you can still eat a little bit. So you can get the box of soups and olives sent to your house and participate in this fasting mimicking diet. The idea of the diet is to promote cellular renewal, metabolic health, mental clarity, and energy, and bonus, potentially a small amount of weight loss, particularly belly fat. So that's kind of some of the clinical application, the more applied areas of science. There's one more noteworthy individual in the scientific realm that I want to lift up, and that's Mikhail Blagosklany. I point him out simply because his Twitter profile says he is in search of immortality, longevity, and his area of focus is longevity and aging. And his diet advice I find deeply problematic. If you look at the outlined box there, the best strategy to lose weight is to forget the concept of breakfast, lunch, and dinner altogether. Just try not to eat as long as you can. And so I think it doesn't work, I'll say that. I'm sure, yes, I'm sure it's very compelling. However, as we think about fasting, and particularly now we're kind of shift gears into some of the theological ideas. I find that deeply problematic to just tell people don't eat and you'll achieve your goals. You'll achieve longevity. You'll achieve weight loss or whatever your goals are simply by not participating in what I find is a very important communal element of our lives, which is eating, and the way that we interact with creation. Probably the most intimate way that we interact with creation is by taking it into our bodies. So as we think about some of the theological implications of this area of science, I just want to have you keep that in mind. And Blagosklany, just one more thing on him, one of his ideas is that we want to beat the 122-year record for human lifespan. He wrote that the concept of absolute compression of morbidity, i.e. a limit on human lifespan, is misleading in humans. Combining anti-aging medicine with cutting-edge medical care, regardless of chronological age, will extend human lifespan further. So you can kind of hear the flatworm research coming up here, this idea that this is not an inevitable process. We can beat the odds. We can break the glass ceiling of 122 years. And his work is really dedicated to finding that out. This might be a familiar face to some of you. Not everyone is very enthusiastic about this idea of extending human lifespan beyond 122 years. Zeke Emanuel, a well-known and respected oncologist and bioethicist, wrote in The Atlantic, 75, and it was like bold, capitalized, 75. That's how long I want to live, 75 years. And he says, here's a simple truth that many of us seem to resist. Living too long is also a loss. It renders many of us, if not disabled, then faltering and declining, a state that may not be worse than death, but is nonetheless deprived. And he expresses the same kind of concern and fear that those 80% of surveyed individuals felt about aging. What will happen to me as I age? How will I feel? What will happen to my body? What will happen to my mind? And he describes this American obsession with cheating death as a new archetype, which he calls the American immortal. And he says, I reject this aspiration. I think this manic desperation to endlessly extend life is misguided and potentially destructive. So here we have, two perspectives in the scientific community. And we're going to kind of now come into some of the theological considerations. I think Christian theology offers a different kind of counter-argument, but also there are proponents of this idea. There are Christian transhumanists, and I encourage you to go look at their website because it's very interesting. But I will say many self-identified Christians throughout history, some of the people we looked at a few slides ago, including Benjamin Franklin and others who I mentioned, did actually support similar progressive ideas. And among the anti-aging proponents are well-known prosperity preachers like Lee Stokes, who is here in North Carolina at the Destiny Christian Center in Greensboro. He claims that it is the will of God for you to be healed 100% of the time, and also for our lives to extend beyond 120 years, very similar to what Mikhail Blagosklany said in the previous slide. And Stokes says here, that, and other prosperity preachers as well, that health is God's divine intention for humanity. Sickness is ultimately an evil, and health is an ultimate good promised to the faithful. He goes so far as to suggest that the whole purpose of communion is to bring healing to your body. This is one of the biggest secrets of the kingdom, to combat the aging process, to combat sickness and decay. And from my estimation, I don't see that in Scripture, but that is one of the big proponents, one of the major tenets of prosperity gospel and healing narratives in that tradition. Christian Orthodox theology would reject this. Stokes' notion that physical healing and longevity are the purpose of God's kingdom and the Christian life. Ethicist Dennis Sansom here at Samford University affirms the importance of recognizing our temporal limitations as created beings. Essentially, we need to accept and recognize that we have physical limitations and temporal limitations, and our goal, our aim as created beings is not to be here forever. He says that the desire to stay autonomous without restrictions eventually compels us either to forget the practical sense of our mortality or to deny it. He goes on and writes that Christian theology becomes a way of telling ourselves that in the midst of our tragedies and sufferings, we have a unity which cannot be taken away from us, because the unity is given by God. And we do not need to exhaust our lives and natural resources by trying to prevent the inevitability of illness and death. In the same vein as Duke's own Stanley Hauerwas, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and other Christian ethicists, Sansom argues that our fixation on life-prolonging technologies and interventions reflects a kind of secular theodicy. Instead of asking why a good God would let evil happen, secular theodicies are humanistic, attempting to make sense of human suffering in light of an otherwise completely senseless history. Rather than understanding history as this unfolding of God's plan, redemption history becomes very anthropocentric and becomes about this idea of transcending all of our problems and injustices and decay and death. I don't know if anyone has had the pleasure of reading this text yet, but I would point to this just for a lovely discussion of the idea of human flourishing and the life of flourishing. But I will say the Christian argument that we just presented by Lee Stokes and their counter-arguments by other theologians really both acknowledge something that I think is a thread throughout this entire conversation about the search for longevity. They all envision a world of human flourishing and recognize that things are not the way they should be. And that, I think, dates back to the early examples I gave in Scripture, as well as the search for the fountain of youth. There's something that's not quite right, and we recognize that as we search for ways to improve our lives. So Miroslav Volf and Crossman, I think, would recognize that this idea, this desire for a better life is not anathema to Christian theology or the story of God that we find in the Bible. They write that the purpose of theology is to discern, articulate, and commend visions of flourishing, and the flourishing life in light of God's self-revelation in Christ. And they call the flourishing life the good life toward which humans are meant to strive. And they think this is the primary concern of theology. It's about our relationship with God and how we thrive in God's good world. And we are indwelt by God through Christ and the Spirit, and that should radically alter how we think about what it means to live. It should alter our human experience, the things that we seek out, how we understand joy and suffering. And they believe that theological study should truly impact how we walk, and not just how we think, but what we do and why we do it. So I'm going to move on to fasting here briefly. What promise does Christian theology have to anchor us? Surely this desire to live a long, healthy, happy life is not antithetical to God's good plan for humanity. After all, Genesis depicts the Creator God molding human bodies from the elements of the earth, blessing an embodied humanity, giving them food and saying that it's all very good. And, our material bodies, I think, cannot be inherently bad, but Christian thinkers have often contended with this idea. This is a long and storied conversation in Christian theology, the idea of dualism, body and mind, or body and spirit. For example, medieval monastics such as St. Catherine had often practiced forms of asceticism and deprivation in order to achieve socially and culturally valuable goals. And this still happens today. This is not gone, but she's a good example and well known because she is venerated for her extreme fasting. And that ultimately led to her death in 1347. Through starvation, she was considered a model of Christian virtue. And I think we should question that. I think that is a deeply problematic way of modeling virtue and piety and obedience, especially in an era where so many suffer from disordered eating. Aspects of health, and it's not really being addressed well in the church. Might she embody that sort of disordered understanding, disordered obedience that represents dangers of denying our creatureliness Just a question. But should we recognize and uphold this created body as good rather than as a barrier to our communion with God? Scott McKnight addresses this longstanding issue of body-spirit dualism in his book, Fasting, The Ancient Practices, and he argues for whole body spirituality that involves fasting as an appropriate response to what he calls a grievous sacred moment. It is a spiritual practice in response to a good and loving God when we are in a period of suffering and questioning and grieving in the Christian life. He suggests that a person's need and hunger in the presence of God can be enacted through fasting, as it has throughout history, but not for personal health benefits like weight loss. Possibly also he would reject this application of fasting as a spiritual practice, an anti-aging tool. And one of my questions that I'm exploring right now is whether we as Christians can actually practice fasting spiritually without having those considerations of bodily enhancement, because we know too much. So can we actually be faithful practitioners of this practice? If the method of extending our lives and health, like fasting, through fasting, is not a means to an end, is there a theological argument to be made for purposeful extension of human life and lifespan? Christian eschatology, and I just briefly threw a couple of doctrines up here. I'm sure there are many others that will continue to emerge in my research, but I mentioned eschatology and the doctrines of creation and incarnation, offering nuanced perspectives on life and health in our faith tradition. According to Christian doctrine, the purpose of creation is to reveal the power of divine nature and identity of God. Only after firmly establishing the centrality of God as Father and Son and Holy Spirit can we begin to consider creation and its purpose in relationship to God. All of creation affirms and exalts this triune God to reveal God's glory. It's not about us. And as created beings, our epistemology is fundamentally embodied. We don't have another way of existing in this world. And we should investigate through faith and spiritual growth what that means. God's perfect unity, eternity, and immutability illuminate and enable the particularities of our material life. Christianity proclaims that the central event of creation is the incarnation. God took on flesh and became human. God is at the heart of creation. And human creatures must recognize our participation in God's project of partnership and the renewal of creation as we are ordained to steward. Bless and care for everything and everyone in God's good world, including ourselves. Despite Christian confession of God's centrality in creation, Christians have committed innumerable atrocities and enduring damage against human and non-human creation throughout history. One question for us to contend with is what's gone wrong and how humanity has imagined itself as a main actor. Has that actually contributed to many of the problems we see in the world today? One more bit of theology, and I will bring in biblical ethicist Jacob Schatzer, who argues that the incarnation of Jesus Christ, the union of deity and humanity, this Christ incarnate can really be the grounding framework for us as we consider what it means to be embodied. He says that this infleshing of the eternal Son of God in human form is the incarnation. But why did God become flesh? It is tempting to focus solely on how the incarnation makes salvation possible. Jesus did not become human so that humans could escape humanness. Rather, he became human to save humans as humans, to promise. Sorry, I lost my place. To promise us resurrection bodies, people resisted this idea right out of the gate. Even in Jesus' time and shortly after, followers of other religious movements held that the answer to the human plight was an escape from the body. The doctrine of incarnation can help us to understand and value our bodies as God does, as both created and redeemable. We too will have resurrection bodies. As Schatzer writes, if we buy into transhumanism's picture of a possible disembodied experience, it might make it harder for us to believe in the goodness of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, fully God, fully human. Instead, we may begin to alter our beliefs about Christ because our beliefs about the promises of a post-human future. And that, I think, is the real danger of the particular direction that transhumanism and the longevity movement pose for Christians. Christ came incarnate. As fully divine and fully embodied, we as image bearers reflect something of God's self, even as we are fully embodied. Being embodied is everything it means to be human. We breathe, we eat, we metabolize, we develop, reproduce, and die, just like the flatworms. But we die having hope that things will be made new. Christians die believing that God will bring about a new creation, including our bodies. This is a creation in which we will participate. In the eschaton, things will finally be as they should be. That question that I think all of these people were asking, why do we suffer and die? Why is the world not the way that it should be? Christians have hope for an answer to that question. The image of this new creation centers around banquet feasting, not fasting. For Christians, hope is not rooted in more years in the here and now. If we live long, healthy lives, that is very good. Many of us will not. Many lives are lost to sickness and war. All of us will die. But we believe that one day, sin and death will lose their sting, that wrongs will be made right, and that God's upside-down kingdom will be right side up. Things will finally be as they should be. Thank you. It's fine. Not take it personally.
Say that the artist is here with us. That is just an incredible
Thank you.
work of art.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have time for questions?
Yeah, if you do. Yeah.
Great.
So I guess it's a two-part sort of question. So when I think about these things, I think about just how does this not become just this massive narcissistic endeavor where you're just, each of us is so completely obsessed with our own functions and data that we completely lose touch with other people. And secondarily, is there an equal amount of research and concern and planning with the social implications? Like, we already have a huge number of issues we're all aware of.
Yeah.
Does this just compound? And so a few live these wonderful endless lives and the rest.
It's a very astute question, and one that I run an annual conference on personalized nutrition, and that's one that we brought up recently with some of the researchers doing this work. And there's two sides to that argument. Yes, this could be a very narcissistic endeavor where people who wear all the smart watches, et cetera, they're mining their data. We have information. Who is that accessible to? Who are those interventions available to? Most people, even though genetic testing isn't very expensive, in order to get the supplement protocols, the books, do the research, understand everything, pay for the services, the healthcare practitioners, the MRIs, all of these sort of unnecessary interventions, it's incredibly expensive. So right now, the answer is it's available to very few people who have the time and the money to invest in understanding that about themselves. And what's the return on that investment? We don't know. A couple of years, maybe? How much time did you give to that endeavor, and what do you get out of it? So, I think that's a really important question. And then to the issue of accessibility is incredibly important in the field of personalized nutrition. Again, those who have the largest burden of disease around the world are those who have very few resources, very little access to food, let alone longevity-enhancing interventions. And one of the arguments that I've heard made is like, oh, it's kind of like when we were learning about flying, originally air travel was only available to very few, but now look, there is so much investment and everyone has access to this incredible technology. I'm sure there's something to that argument, but there's an aspect of Christian social justice that I think needs to be considered when we talk about longevity. Whose lives are valued such that we will allow them, to have access to things that might enhance their lifespan and the quality of their health over that period of that life. No one's really given me a good answer on that yet, and I think it's unfolding, and time will tell. But I think those are incredibly important questions to ask. Yes.
Yes. Hi. Let's see. I always thought 1 Corinthians 6:9-20 talks, about your body being the temple of the Holy Spirit, and I'm a health practitioner.
Oh, good.
And I have often thought that we should really focus on this phrase from the Bible in terms of focusing people on health and well-being, because if you don't take care of your body, then you can't take care of your mind, and you can't do the things that we talked about today in church. You can't be that loving person who goes out and does good for others. So I think that's one point I want to make. The other point is that when we talk about nutrition and stress and health and all those things that go into it, and epigenetics and telomeres, et cetera, we have to start with the neonate, with the child and onward. And we spend so much time and thought and energy in the disease-based discussions of health, as opposed to the nutrition of health starting early on. And that's absolutely essential. Have you been studying how the nutrition from birth or perinatal through the end of life affects health?
Yes, I actually teach life cycle nutrition at
I heard you say that quickly in the beginning.
Yeah.
I don't refer much to it.
Yeah, I do. I'm sure there are plenty of other avenues to explore, but that's an incredibly important point that, when we don't have the capacity to feed children well, or we don't have the knowledge to feed children well, that sets them up for difficulties in the next stage of life. So it compounds, right? So if you have a really healthy childhood, there's plenty of research showing that, healthy children become healthy teenagers, become healthy adults, and there's a lot of potential for the reverse is true as well, that children who are deprived of nutrients, of social interaction around food, tend to have behavioral, academic, health problems down the road. So I think that's an incredibly important point. And I don't know that anyone in the longevity space is really working in children right now, because it's such a new field in nutrition that everyone's really focused on, this disease care model instead of the health care model that a lot of people in my field are really pushing for. And as I mentioned at the beginning in my introduction, embedding nutrition into the healthcare system so that it becomes part of what we talk about at every stage of life with every patient. And of course, preconception and prenatal interventions have the enormous potential with epigenetics to have lasting effects through generations, possibly. So, yeah. Yep. Yeah. And then to the idea of, the body being a temple. Do we think about our bodies that way when we move about the world, when we live our daily lives? I ask a lot of people, what do you think nutrition is for? And most people say, food is fuel, or, energy, or calories. And very few people take a step to say that food is how we engage in a created world. It's how we bring creation into our bodies. It breaks down and it becomes us. Those building blocks of our bodies are coming from the amino acids and the nutrients in the soil. In the plants. And there's nothing more beautiful, I think, than that paradigm of creation, that we have a world that is made to be, that we are made to be part of in a very intimate and biological, tangible way, as well as spiritual ways. So I think that is something to really keep in mind. And I will invite you all to think about that on your lunch today as you're eating. Hopefully you won't skip lunch.
Any other thoughts or questions? We do, of course, every Sunday come and celebrate a feast. So I appreciate you pointing out how important the community aspects of it are, and also saying that that's important for children too, the social aspects of eating. It's not just the vitamins and the protein, that is truly something to think about.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really thought-provoking.
Thank you all. I appreciate you coming and joining me today. Thank you.